Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSet live lectures. Dear friends, today in food microbiology we will be talking about safe food and introduction to HACCP. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Shalini Sehgal. Dr. Sehgal is Associate Professor in Department of Food Technology in Bhaskaracharya College of Applied Sciences, University of Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome ma'am to our studios and request her to start the lecture. Welcome ma'am.
Thank you Amrit. Good afternoon all of you. Today's lecture is on safe food and introduction to HACCP. This is one of the lecture which is going to be in series what we have been talking about food safety. So today we will be introducing safe food, which is virtually a recap of what we have done earlier, and then we are going to see the implementation of this HACCP as a system to produce safe food in food industry. So when I give this lecture, I have divided this into two halves. One is the objectives and other are the contents. So the objective for today is we are going to understand the origin and developments of the HACCP system and its current significance. And to understand this objective, we will be going through the origin of HACCP as a system, advantages of the HACCP approach, applicability and the world trade and HACCP. So when I talk about safe food or food safety, it means that the food will not cause harm to the consumer when it is prepared or eaten according to its intended use. This means all the conditions and measures that are necessary for the food production have to be taken care of. We have to talk right from the beginning of the food production till the end of the chain where the consumer is having the food. So whenever we talk about the concept of safe food, it is a product which is free of hazards, and these hazards, they can be microbiological, chemical or physical. So when we talk about food safety data across the world, we see that there are a number of factors which are contributing to foodborne illnesses. These factors, a very important one, actually it contributes around 63%, is the temperature abuse. If the temperature is not proper for the storage of food, we are going to end up with certain type of foodborne illnesses. Then when we are talking about the other factors, they can be cleaning, they can be the use of leftovers, cross-contamination, and yes, intentional and incidental chemical additives. So when we talk about the food, physical hazard, it is any potentially harmful extraneous matter that comes into the food. It can be glass, wood, stone, metal scraps, plastic, hair, dirt. These contaminants can also come from natural part of food or bones. For example, bones in chicken or fish. Anything that will cause a physical injury when you are going to swallow it. When you swallow the food, there are chances that you can get any kind of injury, and usually these items are known as physical hazards. Then the second category, when we talk about the hazards in food, is the chemical hazards. These can be naturally occurring, means they are already present in the food. The second category is the intentionally added, means they have been purposely added, and this intentionally added ones are also known as adulterant in food. Then the third category is unintentionally added, means they are coming from the environment. When we talk about the naturally occurring chemical hazards, usually they are toxins. These toxins are either coming from the fish, the shellfish, or they are coming from the molds, the mycotoxins. And the most potent mycotoxin in that category is aflatoxin. Then we have various types of toxins which are coming through the seafoods. They can be paralytic, they can be diarrheic, they can be neurotoxic or amnesic in nature. When we talk about the intentionally added chemicals, the food additives, these are allowed. These are allowed under GMPs, which stands for Good Manufacturing Practices. These intentionally added chemicals can be of three categories such as preservatives, nutritional additives and color additives. When we talk about preservatives, these can be nitrite and sulfiting agents which we are adding in case of meat and meat products. These can be nutritional additives, for example vitamin A, niacin, which are usually added as fortifying agents because their deficiency leads to various kind of diseases, and colors. Any food which we eat has to be aesthetically appealing. So, there is a wide range of color which is being used in food, and this color has to be food grade in nature. When we talk about unintentionally or incidentally added chemicals, this is a very large category, and this is one category where we have chemicals, we have hard elements, we have toxic elements. For example, when we talk about chemicals in agriculture, it's a wide range of chemicals which are used in agriculture. They can be pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, fertilizers, antibiotics, and growth hormones. These are integral part of growing crop in the Indian system. So, they enter into the food chain through the crops and they affect the consumers. Then we have toxic elements and compounds such as lead, zinc, arsenic, mercury, cyanide. These are all hard metals which are usually coming through the water sources. So, you can find these material in aquaculture, various types of fish. Then we can have various types of direct and indirect additives. We have direct and indirect type of additives. Then we have secondary and direct additives which can be lubricants, they can be cleaning compounds, they can be sanitizers, they can be various types of paints which are being used in the food, and most of them they come from the contact surfaces. When the food is being manufactured in the food industry, most of the secondary additives, they come in contact with the food. A big category of allergen also comes through food. A food allergy is body's negative reaction to a particular food or foods. There are various types of allergens which are there. They can be milk and dairy products. They can be egg and egg products, fish, shellfish, wheat, soya and soya products. And we can also have peanut and other nuts. Now, when we talk about hazards in foods, the biological hazard is a very big category. They come through bacteria, viruses, molds, yeast, parasites. All these categories, they can be found in food and they create a threat to the safety of the food. The biggest group among these are the bacteria which are found in very large numbers and they enter food through various sources. Now, when we talk about the microorganisms and especially the viruses, they are slightly different because the requirement for other microorganisms like bacteria, yeast and molds, they need time, temperature to grow, they need nutrients, they also need an optimum pH to grow, they also need oxygen. Now, requirement of oxygen can be no air, minimal air or air. And on the basis of this oxygen requirement, we put them into three categories: aerobes, anaerobes. The last and the important thing is the moisture in the food, which plays a very, very critical role. As you all know, any food which is dry in nature or which is powder lasts longer. For example, the milk powder will last longer than the normal milk which we take. When we are talking about the safety aspect and we are going to talk HACCP in detail, we should also understand the fact what is this temperature danger zone. When we are talking about the microorganisms, we need to keep the food we have to keep the food away from a particular temperature which ranges from, let's say, 4 to 60. Now, why this is known as the danger zone? Because this is a zone where the microorganisms are going to multiply and divide very fast. So, most of the bacteria, they are active between 4 to 60, which is the danger zone, and whenever we want to preserve or save food, we should take the food either above 60 or below 4. Therefore, the golden rule is to keep the food hot, that is above 60 degrees C, or keep it cold in case you are going to store the leftovers. Technically, we should not be consuming any leftover food. Now coming to the concept of HACCP, which is the main part of the lecture today, I would like to introduce HACCP as a food safety management system. Now how this system is different? This system is science-based and it is very, very systematic. Why it is systematic? Because we need to trace the source of contamination. So we have to have a systematic approach. And when we were talking about HACCP as a system, it's a preventative approach. We want to prevent the outbreak of foodborne disease. People should not fall sick after consuming the food. So when we talk about HACCP and we want to make it as a preventive system, then it has to be applicable throughout the food chain. What is this food chain? Food chain means right from the beginning till the consumption of the food, from the primary producer to the consumer. HACCP, the full form of HACCP is Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point System. Why do we need to put HACCP in place? Like we have discussed earlier, there are various types of hazards which are going to enter the food, and if they are not going to be controlled, they are going to cause adverse health effects. These hazards, they can, as we have already seen, they are biological, chemical and physical. So HACCP is basically a system which is trying to control the entry of undesirable hazards into the food and making it and keeping it safe. So whenever we talk about HACCP as a system, it is not a standalone system. When we talk about a standalone system means it does not need any other support mechanism. But for HACCP, there are essential blocks, we call them as the prerequisites, which are very, very critical for the use or to make this HACCP a very strong or a system-based, system approach-based system. So when we talk about HACCP, we have the terms which are closely related as SSOPs. These are your standard operating procedures. And most of the time, the sanitary procedures are very, very critical. Therefore, we call them as sanitary standard operating procedures, SSOPs. Then we have training. So any person who is talking about HACCP has to be trained in that particular field. Whenever we talk about HACCP, we have already seen that HACCP is a preventative system. We have to prevent the hazard from entering, and when we talk about this particular system, we have to have a recall mechanism in place. Why a recall is needed? Because there are chances if the food is contaminated or it is not safe, we should have a standby mechanism of procuring that food and returning it back to the food industry so that the people who consume it are not at threat. Then when you talk about training and you talk about recall, there have to be programs in place. You need to train the people who are going to handle food in case of contamination, in case of some kind of a chemical outbreak which has happened, or some undesirable entry of the chemical contaminant has taken place into the food. So training is very, very key feature of HACCP as a system. Now when you want to train people and you want to tell them about food safe, what is safe food? They should also know about the rules, laws of the land, because there are certain additives which can be added into the food. Therefore, anybody who talks about HACCP should be well versed that what are the additives and in what amount, because amount, as we have discussed in earlier lecture also, these are very, very important. Otherwise, a normal additive like salt also makes the food unsafe if it is not added in the right amount. So when we talk about the rules and regulations, we have to see which rule applies to which kind of a process, and we have to follow HACCP in accordance with the protocol of the land. And HACCP is one system which will not work alone. you have to have good manufacturing practices and you have to have good hygienic practices. Otherwise, your very purpose of HACCP is defeated. Now coming back to the origin, how this concept of HACCP came into the being. It was pioneered in 1960s by a company which is known still there, Pillsbury is a company. It was not made for normal humans, it was meant for astronauts. NASA was the company, was the organization which looked towards safe food, and they wanted to give safe food their astronauts who were going into the outer space. So first time the HACCP concept was used for outer space foods so that people do not fall sick on expeditions, such expeditions which take them even outside our galaxy. So HACCP started, the journey of HACCP started in 1960s, and it is recognized as an effective system of controls around the globe. So when we talk about HACCP as a system, we always see that the journey started in 1969, and HACCP was part of International Code of Practice, and we started with General Principles of Food Hygiene. After that, in 1985, we had certain amendments, it was revised and other features were added. 1994 was a big thing in terms of food safety because an agreement of sanitary and phytosanitary measure was signed. 1997, we got the third revision of International Code of Practice, and we added more hazards to this particular list. And 2003 is a big day for the history of HACCP because on this particular day we had the fourth revision, and this International Code of Practice now had the GHPs, and most of the hazards were included in this particular system. Now when we talk about HACCP as a system and its implementation, we need to understand HACCP as a system which moves step by step. The first thing what we need to understand about HACCP is that it is a system which is based on 7 principles, which we will be doing in the next lecture. When we talk about HACCP, it's a process-based approach. It is not a process, it's not a product-based approach, but we are just talking about a product which is following a certain processing conditions and is being converted into raw material. So whenever we talk about HACCP and its implementation, we need to understand key messages, and these messages can be that it is a response to the need to be more confident about food safety. We should have various types of GMP systems in place, and the HACCP has an international approach. The same system should apply to all the countries. So we will be taking this up in the next lecture. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Welcome to the second part of the lecture. Now we are going to talk about implementation of HACCP. So before we go for the introduction of HACCP, we need to understand what are the key messages from HACCP. The first one is, it is a response to the need to be more confident about food safety. A country like India, where we are always compromising on the safety of food, needs a system like HACCP. Most of the time, HACCP is a system which is being used in the dairy industry in our country. Why? Because majority of food industry is unorganized sector. We could not put HACCP in place. Then when we are talking about HACCP, like I have told you in the last lecture, HACCP is not a standalone system. If you are not following GHPs, you are not following good manufacturing practices, then we cannot talk about HACCP in isolation. We cannot talk about safe food, because for having safe food, we need to focus on the environment, on the factory premises, on the personnel who are handling this food. So we have to have GHP practices, good manufacturing practices, then only we can talk about safe food. In fact, the lab inside the food industry should also be following the good laboratory practices or the GLPs. When we talk about HACCP as a system, it is very, very essential because it improves the brand image of the food product. And when you talk about food product as such, when you talk about the food product, it will give you a acceptability. International acceptability means people show trust in HACCP as a system, and if you have the HACCP and the ISO mark on the food product, the consumer feels that the food is safe. There are no hazards which are associated with this particular food which is being consumed by him or her. When we talk about the HACCP as a concept, there are certain definitions which are integral part of hazard analysis critical control point systems. The first thing is hazard. What is this hazard which we talk? So hazard, there are multiple types which we have already discussed in the earlier lecture. They can be from a living source, they can come from a chemical source, or they can also come as a physical source in the food. Now, why are we talking about a hazard? Because it poses a risk to the consumer. Risk means it can be a small injury if it is a physical hazard, or it can be even hospitalization if it is caused by a biological or a chemical agent. So what are we trying to do with the HACCP is to reduce the amount of risk. So what is a risk? The risk is a function of the probability of an adverse health effect. Probability of an adverse health effect is very, very critical, because whenever we talk about food as a system, it is never associated with zero risk. Nowhere in the world anybody can produce a food which is 100% safe. So there is no concept of zero risk with food. We have to always reduce the risk and we have to make it to the minimum level. For example, on the basis of risk, we have various types of foods. The foods can be high risk foods. A common example is milk, anything which is coming from dairy, meat, they all are high risk foods. Then we have medium risk foods. Medium risk foods are the foods which do not have a large amount of moisture. So lack of moisture or low water activity does not allow the microorganisms to grow, and this food is then a medium risk food. On the contrary, a dry powder, let's say skim milk powder, SMP, is a low risk food because there is no water. If there is no water, this means no moisture, no water activity associated. This means it is not a favorite of microorganisms to grow. Therefore, whenever we talk about HACCP as a system, we have to also keep in mind what are we talking about, which kind of a food it is. Is it a high risk food? Is it a medium risk food? Or it is a low risk food? Because the CCPs, which we are going to study shortly, will change depending upon the food which is being talked about. Now, why are we talking so much about HACCP? Why HACCP? First of all, it is a cornerstone. Like I told you, the term HACCP builds a trust in the consumer that the food is safe. And this is not only in our country, across the globe. If a HACCP system is in place, yes, the outcome most likely is going to be the safe food. Then when we are talking about HACCP as a system, it is a proactive it is a proactive management system. Why proactive? Because it's very, very dynamic. We can make changes, and once we make the changes, the food which is being produced out of the system is safe. Now when we talk about HACCP as a system, why we use the word management? Because we have to manage all the hazards. We should not allow the biological hazards, the chemical hazards, or any type of hazards which is coming from the environment into the food. So we need to manage, and for managing we should be focused. And what is the focus? The focus should be on prevention, because food, when it is being produced or is being manufactured, it comes in constant touch with the environments. There are hazards, like I told you in the last lecture, which also creep in unintentionally. Farmer has put the pesticide, but the food producer does not know how much is the amount of the pesticide. Once the food is processed from the raw material, we realize the pesticide residues are in higher amount. So we have to focus on prevention, and how this prevention can be done by following a code of certain good practices, and these practices are not only in the farm, they have to be followed in the plant, and they have to be followed at all the stages when the food is being manufactured or even the food is being packed. So therefore, we will find that we are not only talking about good manufacturing practices, we are also talking about good hygienic practices, we are also talking about good lab practices, and we need to integrate good farm practices also, because if the raw material is not good, it is going to affect the quality of the food product. The third point, which is very, very important for HACCP as a system, is that we need to focus on safe food. Now the awareness levels are high, people need safe food. We only talk about nutritional aspect of the food, but gradually from the last decade, we also need wholesome but safe food for all the consumers. And when you are talking about HACCP as a system, it is a transnational system. We have to talk about a larger level. We cannot be area specific, because due to the globalization, in each and every town we are getting the material which is not grown there. It is not the local produce. We are getting the material across countries. Sitting at one end of the country, you can order food from across the various zones in India or even outside India. So the approach has to be a transnational system of production and consumption. When we talk about a larger system, then the approach has to be very, very systematic, and we need to identify the specific hazards. Now why there is a need for identification of specific hazards? Because these hazards which we talk about, they are not only coming in all the food produce. It will be area specific, it will be zone specific. The hazards will vary from place to place, the approach of the system, the raw material which is being used. So we have to systematically identify the hazards which are going to enter a particular food system. Then only we can talk about HACCP as a management system. Therefore, the HACCP, usually we say the approach has to be from the raw material to the end. We are talking about a concept which is coming farm to fork. Till it is grown in the farm and till it is consumed, we are talking about the entire system under HACCP. Now what is the limitation? Why do we need the system which is the HACCP system? Is that we are talking about testing and inspection of the food at various levels. Because once the raw material is not free from hazards, we cannot think of a product which is safe for consumption. So the quality affects the end product also. Therefore, we need to take farmer or the primary producer into confidence, and we have to take this chain. The entire mechanism is a very step-based approach, that each step we need to make sure that the food is safe, the raw material quality is good, the environment where it is being processed is good, and the people who are handling this food are free from diseases and they are not associated with any kind of hygiene issues. Now, when we talk about HACCP, it is a 7-principle approach. These principles are very, very important, and all these 7 principles, they have to be taken step by step. So, all these, whenever you talk about HACCP, first of all, we have to take 5 steps which are very, very critical. The first step is assemble the HACCP team. Now, when we talk about food plants or food industry, it has to be a holistic approach. Not only the production manager, but the person inside the lab, the person who is procuring the raw material, they also should be the part of the HACCP team. Actually, the HACCP team has to be a multidisciplinary team. Then the second step, you need to describe the product. Why this description is so very critical? Because if you do not describe the product, you will not know what are the raw materials which have been added to the product and what is the source of those raw materials. So, when we talk about the product, we should know which raw material and in what amount it has been added. The third and very important step, identify the intended use, because the use will also cut down the risk which is associated. For example, if you are having a food product which you are going to take as such, then you have to make sure that it is safe. On the other hand, if it is a food product which you have to heat before consumption, then the hazards are different, and this step will also take care of certain hazards which might have grown during the storage or during the transportation system. The fourth step, after you have identified the intended uses, to construct the flow diagram. Why it is important? Because if you do not know the process flow chart, how you are going to estimate what are the critical control points, what are the critical steps in which the hazards, they can come down into your system, they can enter the product through the process. So, this construction of flow diagram is very, very important, and this flow diagram, it should be very, very detailed and descriptive. Now, what is the meaning of detailed and descriptive means? If you are talking about a temperature, heating, so merely writing heating will not help us. We have to write heating to what degree? 80 degree, 60 degree, 70 degree. So, we have to specify the heating temperature, and not only the temperature but also the time, 60 for 5 minutes or 60 for 10 minutes, because the time will also affect the safety of that particular food product. The next step what we have is, we have to on-site confirmation of the process flow chart. Now, when you are making a flow chart, you have to go to the shop floor and you have to actually see each step is being followed, and you have to match with the flow chart that the time temperature combinations are being met. We are having the steps in the same sequence, the steps are being repeated one after the other, or are we jumping from one step to the other without talking about the key safety issues. So, an online check is very, very important. Therefore, we always say HACCP needs a practical approach. It is a hands-on system. You have to see the system actually working. It is not a theoretical system. It should be practically seen how it is working. So, when we talk about HACCP as a system, after you have made the flow chart, you have done the online check, you have gone to the process, or the, let's say you have understood the entire process module, you have to start analyzing. The first step is what hazards. The step 2 is the analysis of those hazards. So, we have to do the first principle, that is to conduct a hazard analysis. Now what is hazard analysis? We have already seen that 3 types of hazards can come into the food. So we need to understand in that particular food whether it is a physical hazard which is going to come in, or whether it is a chemical hazard, or is there any step which is promoting the growth of microbes and there are chances of certain microbes coming into the food. So first step is conduct a hazard analysis, type of hazard and the step where it is most likely to get into the food. This is the first principle. The second is determine the CCPs. The full form of CCP is critical control points. What are the critical control points? Always in a food manufacturing unit, there will be critical steps, but are they actually the CCPs? So whenever you talk about HACCP as a system, you should also be differentiating between the critical control points and the critical points. Now, what is the CCP and what is a CP? Critical control point means that if you do not take precautions and that particular step, chances are that the hazard will move into the next step. For example, in the manufacturing of milk, pasteurization time temperature is a critical control point. But why it is a critical control point? Because after pasteurization, you have to cool the milk. If you do not cool the milk, then the chances are that your milk, although it's being pasteurized, it has not undergone the thermal shock. The microorganisms have not shifted from a temperature of, let's say, HTST temperature of 71.7 degrees C to 5 degrees C, because this shock is very, very critical for the microorganism, because this shock is going to kill those microorganisms. So pasteurization along with this intermediate or immediate, I should be using the word immediate cooling, is a critical control point for a milk manufacturing unit. When we talk about the critical control points, we need to understand these critical control points, and then we come to the concept of critical limits, because any critical point will have to have limits. If those limits are not assigned, then we won't be able to understand the deviations in the food process, and it will lead to a food which is not safe for the consumer consumption. So when we talk about the CCPs, the step 3 or the third principle of HACCP is to establish the critical limits for each critical control point. Now, when you establish the critical limits, it's not only the critical limits which we are going to talk. We have to also understand, if we do not set the limit, then how the deviations are going to affect the product. So we should also know the upper maximum limit, and we should also know the lower limit, because we have to make sure that the food product is strictly following these limits. Now, since these limits will make your food unsafe, then we need to go to the next principle, which is equally important, and that is monitoring. If you do not monitor the system, if you do not know how the deviations are happening, then probably your system is going to fail. Your food product is going to be unsafe. Therefore, we have to have a monitoring system for each critical control point. Now, when you are monitoring and suddenly a deviation is happening, this means the food which is under process, which is being processed, is not safe now. So it's very tough in the food industry to throw the entire lot. So we should also put corrective mechanisms in place. These are known as corrective actions. And this forms the fifth principle of HACCP, that you have to put corrective actions in place. Either we redo the product, we send it back. For example, in milk pasteurization, if your temperature is not coming up to the mark, the milk has to be cooled, and we have to make sure that the temperature of the device of your pasteurizer is exactly the one which we want it to be on. Otherwise, we have to redo the cycle, we have to restart the entire system all over again. So there is no purpose of monitoring if you do not have any corrective measures in place. You have to understand that deviation has happened, which is very normal, if deviations are happening, the corrective mechanisms have to be understood. Therefore, we need to have a multidisciplinary HACCP team where the engineers are also there, because if there is a breakdown in the machine, the production manager should know whom to contact, and the engineer should be able to guide us through the entire system if any kind of a failure or deviation is happening. After you have the corrective action, we come to the next step, which is the verification. You took a corrective action, but are you sure that the food is safe now? So for that, we should have a verification system in place. You should have certain tests, you should have certain data loggers, you should have certain devices which should be able to say that the corrective action taken by you has kept the food safe. They need to verify that the food which is going to be used by the end consumers is safe in spite of the deviation, in spite of the limit which was critical has been crossed. So the corrective actions have to be very prompt, they have to be very scientific, and they have to be taken instantly if there is any deviation which is going to happen. There should be a person who should be verifying it. So whenever we talk about HACCP, verification is one more key area which we need to understand. Otherwise, HACCP as a system is going to be not as useful as we intend it to be. After the verifications, you have done the verification, so you have to put documents. So the last principle, which is very important for any food plant or any food industry, is that we need to put documentation and record keeping. Earlier, the emphasis never used to be on record keeping and documentation, but as we are talking about HACCPs and we are talking about food safety management systems, it is very critical that we not only keep the records, and we need to put all the corrective measures also. Why? The next question we should ask is, why do we need to keep these documents? If a new person is taking over the shop floor, you should know what mechanisms are there. The HACCP team has to be an alert and informed team. Anything can happen, we can have breakdowns, so we should be always fully prepared. So documentation will always help us how to tackle a particular problem which has occurred. If it is reoccurring, then the people, the HACCP team, they seriously need to look into why it is reoccurring, and they have to find the right corrective measures, and they need to solve the problems. Otherwise, the quality of the food is going to be compromised, and the food which comes out is going to be unsafe for human consumption. So when we are talking about HACCP implementation, and when we talk about HACCP, in total we have 12 steps. What are these 12 steps? Like we have seen earlier, the first 5 steps are how the management is going to form a team which is going to do in-house study, which are going to formulate the process flow charts, who are going to check on shop floor whether these process flow charts are being actually followed. Then we have to base our research or the HACCP study on the basis of the 7 principles. So whenever any organization is talking about HACCP, we say it's a 12-step approach. First 5 and then 7 principles. So when we are talking about HACCP implementation, and we are talking about the HACCP team, and these are the basic steps. We always say that if you talk about the product, you start describing the product, you should also talk about the process and the raw material also, because the vendor who is supplying you the raw material should meet the standards. They need to meet the specifications, because otherwise this raw material will be used in a product which will not be able to meet its critical limits of specifications which are there. So whenever we talk about HACCP, we have to have a process which is very systematic. We have to move step by step. So when we talk about the product, we have to tell the supplier to set the stage for hazard analysis. Now, the supplier can say, or the supplier can ask self, what can go wrong? What can be wrong if my raw material is contaminated? Then what is the outcome? So whenever we talk about what can go wrong, it can be a two-prong approach where we say, what is the severity of the hazard? Means how severe is the hazard? Is this hazard taken care by the processing conditions which we are going to use later? If the answer is yes, then we have to have a different approach. And on the other hand side, what is the probability of the occurrence? Like what can go wrong? What is the probability? 1 in 100, 1 in 1000, 1 in 10,000? Because when we are talking about HACCP as a system, we have to really focus on the hazards which are going to cause illness or injury unless controlled. We have to think about a hazard which will cause an injury to the consumer or which will lead to hospitalization. So, we need to do a hazard analysis first of all, and we have to determine the percentage risk. Then we come to the second step. We have to determine the CCPs. Now, with the CCP also comes the question, where do I need to exert control so that I do not have a food safety hazard? Because whenever you talk about food, it is associated with risk. Why? Because most of the food plants, they are not automated. The food is constantly coming in touch with various types of contact surfaces. There are various types of workers, there are various types of packers who are handling the food. So, the question should be, where do I need to exert control? And usually at this point we talk about a concept of CCP decision trees. That is your critical control point decision tree, or we also call it as a risk analysis matrix. We have to draw a matrix and we have to move step by step analyzing whether this hazard is being taken care in the next step or not. If the answer is no, then we have to put a hurdle there. We have to tackle that hazard there itself. So, when we are talking about the CCP, this is known as the CCP decision tree. You can see a flow chart, and this flow chart itself is self-explanatory because first question, the most important question, is there a hazard at this process step? We need to ask this question at every process step. If it is no, if your answer is no, means there is no hazard associated, this means we do not need a critical control point. We do not need to make it as a CCP. But if the answer is yes, then we move on to the question 2, that is, are preventive measures in place for the identified hazard? Can we control this hazard? If the answer is no, then the next question, which is very, very important, marked here, is control at this step required for safety? You have to take a control. If you have to make a control, and if your answer is yes, this means you have to go back, you have to start your process again, you have to modify the step of the process or the working of your product. If the answer is no, this means it is not a critical control point, you can move on to the next one. Now, if you have preventive measures which are already in place and they are taking care of all these issues, then the third question which comes is, does the process step eliminate or reduce the hazard to an acceptable level? This is very, very important to understand. Why? Because we cannot remove the hazards which are there in the food to a zero level. Why? Because if you remove the hazard from the food, it is going to affect the certain functionality of that particular food. So, it is always not possible to bring down to a hazard to a zero level. It is always to an acceptable level. If the answer is yes, that you can bring down or eliminate the hazard to an acceptable level, then yes, it becomes a CCP. It is a critical control point. And if you say no, you cannot remove this hazard, you cannot lower down, then we have to move to the question 4, which is very, very critical. That says, if this hazard is present, is it going to affect the consumer? This is a thought-provoking question. If that hazard is not able to reduce to an acceptable limit, will it affect anybody? Again, to this question, if the answer is yes, then probably we have to rethink about it, and we have to ask one more question to ourselves, which is, will a subsequent step take care of this hazard? Because as we all know that HACCP is a systematic approach method. You have to move step by step. You have to ask the questions yes or no. If it is not a critical control point, we should not talk about that process step, but we need to focus on a process step which is associated with hazard and where we are not able to reduce the hazard to an acceptable limit. So, to my last question on this critical decision tree, if the answer is yes, will a subsequent process step eliminate or reduce the hazard to an acceptable level, then we have to again stop. We are not going to talk about this particular step as a CCP. We have to think about the entire process. If we are saying no, we do not have any system which is going to take care of this hazard, then this becomes a critical control point. So, this entire questioning and finding the answers in yes and no helps us in taking the decision whether this process step will be associated with the critical control point or not. It is not empirical that each step has to be a critical control point. We have to be very wisely see that is this hazard reduced in the next step. If it is being reduced and it is no longer there in the final product, then that particular step is only a critical point but not a critical control point. So, when we are talking about the HACCP as a system and when talking about its implementation, then we have to also talk about the step 3, that is we have to identify the intended use for that, and we have to construct the process flow chart, and we have to talk about the margins of control at each CCP. We have to also talk about the step, how do I tell if something goes wrong at a CCP? We should also know what are the measures and the observations which need to be taken place. We have to fix those, we have to be ready with the corrective action as I have suggested earlier. We also need to decide and we need to verify whether the HACCP plan is working or not, and we need to verify with certain types of procedures, and finally we need to put all those procedures in a form of a document and the evidence also that they are taking care of the hazard and they are reducing it to an acceptable limit. So, if you see this particular diagram, you will see that we have to have the prerequisite programs, we have to put the basic steps, that is the HACCP team, we have to put the HACCP team, we have to talk about the product, its intended users, we should know about the process flow chart, and we need to verify. And the HACCP plan is based on all the 7 principles which we have discussed earlier. We have to maintain the records for all the steps which are being undertaken. We have to have the criterions set and we need to validate those. Without validation, HACCP will not work as a system, and when we talk about HACCP as a system, it has to enhance the food safety. If the system is in place, a HACCP system is in place, it will cut down on end product inspection and testing. We can apply the HACCP throughout the food chain. We can make it more productive, more efficient, and it also helps to solve problems promptly. The prompt approach, the proactive approach is the outcome of the HACCP process. So, when we talk about HACCP as a system, it also focuses on greater participation by the food handlers. The people who handle food in the food plant are a very integral part of HACCP. They need to be trained. Like earlier slides we said, they need to be trained about hygiene, good hygiene practices. Now, when we talk about HACCP, it has to be compatible with the quality management programs. So, now you will see with ISO 22000, HACCP is integral part of the food safety system, and it is open for inspections by the regulatory authorities. We are having internal audits, we are having external audits. So, over and over again, we are verifying the system which is in place, that it is leading to the generation of a safe product. And the last but the most important thing, HACCP is a system which builds the confidence of international buyers. And if the buyers are having the confidence, then the economy of the country also increases, because the food is taken outside the country, and the brand image of the Indian food is also better in the developed world. So, when we talk about the application of the HACCP, it is a very powerful tool in food safety management, and it is a process based approach. Thank you so much.
Dear friends, on that note, we would like to thank Dr. Sehgal for coming to our show and delivering this wonderful lecture, and thank you dear friends for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.